He's a world-renowned linguist, cognitive scientist, philosopher, social critic, and activist. He's a professor emeritus here at MIT. He has received numerous awards, recognitions, and honorary degrees all around the world. He's an outspoken critic of neoliberalism, US foreign policies around the world. And he was gracious enough actually to come and speak with us in a Bostonville event back in October 2013, along with two other professors, Professor Aslı Ilsız and Zeynep Türk Yılmaz. He gave us his analysis of the Gezi protests back then. The title of that event was What's Happening in Turkey, and tonight we're using the same title because Turkey never stops to challenge us, and we will continue to challenge what's happening in Turkey by holding these talks. According to Human Rights Foundation of Turkey, at least 142 civilians have been killed between August 16 and February 5. These are some estimates, but the violence is escalating, and the war in Syria is affecting Turkey, and obviously the position Turkey's taking in that war is also affecting the region. So without further ado, I would like to leave it to Professor Chomsky for his take on what's happening. The first half will be him speaking to us, and the second half we will take questions. We will do a Q&A session. We do need to pass the microphone for the question to be heard and to be recorded. Thank you.
Title that's, can you hear me first of all? Yes. The title that's announced up there is pretty broad, much too broad for me to try to address in these few comments, but feel free to bring up other things later. I'm going to concentrate on Turkey and its immediate impact on the nearby region. I'm sure you've read about the recent, the ongoing negotiations between Turkey and the European Union on refugees. The cynicism of this agreement has come under sharp and quite justified criticisms by the human rights organizations and others. But it's important to recognize that the criticism may be a little misleading in one important respect. It may suggest, as much of the discussion tends to do, that this is something new, and it's not. It's a broken record, not just with regard to Turkey, but much more generally. Important to understand, though I'll just keep Turkey here and Europe. One crucial matter has to do with what is called the refugee crisis. Okay, there's a good bit to say about that, but I'll put it aside and pretend for the sake of discussion that there is a refugee crisis, though exactly what that means is interesting to look at. Critics have pointed out that in order to obtain Turkish agreement to protect Europe from the so-called refugee crisis, the Europeans have agreed to overlook ongoing and mounting crimes of the Turkish state. These range, as you've heard, from the silencing by force of opposition voices. The most recent case was the takeover of the Zaman Group, the main newspaper in Turkey, which was mildly critical of the government after the takeovers, producing predictably government propaganda, from the silencing of opposition voices to the violent and brutal repression that's proceeding in the southeast in the Kurdish areas. And we can add to that something else which deserves some comment, Turkey's intriguing stance with regard to Syria, which is critical to this whole issue. Well, the criticisms are correct, although this is true, but it's quite important to recognize that it's nothing new whatsoever. And in fact, it doesn't even begin to compare, it doesn't come close to comparing to Western complicity in far worse Turkish crimes in the very recent past. In fact, complicity is something of an understatement. More accurately, direct and decisive participation in quite shocking crimes. All of that's important to understand if we want to make sense of current events. I'll keep here to the post-Cold War period. It's a very enlightening period to focus on if we want to understand how foreign policy is designed and implemented. And the reason is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was no longer possible to simply resort to the standard reflexive cold pretext that whatever we're doing, it's because the Russians are coming. When that pretext dissolved, you can see the essence of foreign policy, its design, motives, implementation, in a much brighter light. So how did the United States react to the end of the Cold War? And how does Turkey fit into that conception? There are actually two dimensions of this question that deserve close attention. One has to do with ideology. What was the ideological reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union? And the second has to do with the fact, what in fact happened. With regard to ideology, it's straightforward and pretty interesting. There was, of course, euphoria about the U.S. victory in this cosmic conflict. I'll simply quote some pretty representative comments from the leading intellectual journals, New York Review of Books, New York Times. The United States now emerged as the leader, these are quotes, the leader of the enlightened states. For the first time in history, with the Soviet Union gone, the U.S. was able to pursue principles and values for the first time in history. No more impediment. It could proceed on its mission of saving humanity under the guiding hand of an idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, led by Bill Clinton, whose foreign policy had entered into a noble phase with a saintly glow by 1997, and on like that. Quite a flow of impressive rhetoric. All of this was amplified by a quite remarkable PR campaign to elevate Reagan, who was incidentally never particularly popular, to elevate him to a semi-divine figure, a colossus, quote, whose spirit seems to stride over the country, watching us like a warm and friendly ghost. The kind of words that are rarely heard outside of Pyongyang. In this case, Stanford University institution. Although the swooning went way beyond and is almost universal. So Obama and others worship Reagan as a transformative figure of unbelievable magnificence. Well, that's what the ideology was like. What are the facts like? Well, one immediate question, of course, is what happens to the two military pacts, NATO and the Warsaw Pact? Pretty obvious question when the Cold War ends. There were actually two visions at the time presented in the discussions on this issue, primarily between Mikhail Gorbachev, representing the Soviet Union, and George Bush, #1, statesman Bush, and James Baker, Secretary of State on the other side, also Germans and others. Gorbachev's vision was that both military pacts should be dissolved. and that a Eurasian zone of peace should be created, cooperative zone of peace from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with a number of centers, the centers in Brussels and Moscow and Ankara, perhaps farther east. The U.S. had a different alternative. Namely, the Warsaw Pact should be dissolved, of course, and NATO, instead of dissolving, should expand. First, NATO should expand to East Germany. That was actually in violation of verbal promises to Gorbachev. Gorbachev had made quite a remarkable concession. He had agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join a hostile military alliance, NATO. If you look at the history of the preceding century, that's a pretty astonishing concession. Germany alone had practically wiped out Russia several times in the century, killing tens of millions of people, destroying the country repeatedly. And Gorbachev was saying, okay, Germany can be unified and join a military alliance led by the United States, which is obviously hostile. He did insist on a quid pro quo, namely that NATO would not expand, the phrase was, 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase. That meant East Germany. Nobody even contemplated anything beyond. And he did receive a promise to that effect from the U.S., which immediately reneged on it and moved NATO to East Germany. Gorbachev, of course, complained, but he was instructed that it was only a verbal promise. There was nothing on paper, and the implication is if you're stupid enough to believe in a gentleman's agreement with us, what happens is your problem. It wasn't quite expressed that way. After moving to East Germany, NATO under Clinton then expanded right to the Russian border. This was a move that was pretty harshly criticized by many U.S. high-level senior statesmen, George Kennan and others, described the expansion of NATO as, in their words, a tragic mistake and a policy error of historic proportions. We are now seeing the consequences as the expansion continued. By a few years ago, 28 in 2013, NATO officially offered Ukraine the opportunity to join NATO, quite apart from long-standing historical and cultural connections. Most Ukrainian, the language is Russian, the connection goes way back. Now, this is the absolute heartland of Russian geostrategic concerns. No matter who was in charge in Russia, they consider this a really major threat. And the effect we're now seeing, the conflict in Ukraine, Crimea, very serious conflict. Both sides, by now, NATO troops are right on the Russian border. It's the first time since the Second World War that hostile armies have been at the Russian border, and some memories there about what this meant. Both sides now are expanding their military forces, and the U.S. is quadrupling the NATO mission at the border. Russia is doing the same. They're both taking very provocative acts. NATO, heavily armed NATO forces, United U.S. forces, are carrying out maneuvers literally hundreds of yards from the Russian border. Russia's acting the same way. If you look at the arms control journals, Arms Control Today, they point out, they warn, in fact, that both sides are acting as if war is thinkable. They're both acting in ways which could escalate up to the point where war would break out. Anyone who has looked at the really shocking record of the history of nuclear weapons since the late 1940s, will understand. There's no time to go into it now, but the fact is that if you look at this record, you can see that it's an absolute miracle that we've survived. We've come very close to nuclear war, and that means terminal war for everyone, many, many times. And in fact, new cases keep being revealed. Just a couple of weeks ago, it was revealed that in 1979, the U.S. automated detection systems, both the U.S. and Russia have automated systems which try to detect oncoming attacks. The U.S. ones are far more sophisticated. U.S. systems are satellite run, which means you can see everywhere, all the way into Russia. The Russian systems are basically radar, eyesight run, so they're much more sensitive and surely have nothing like the sophistication of U.S. systems. We know the record in some detail on the U.S. side, and you can be certain that the record on the Russian side must be much worse. Anyway, this is on the U.S. side, one of many cases. In 1979, the U.S. automated systems detected a major missile attack from the Soviet Union. It's taken seriously enough so that it went past the Joint Chiefs of Staff, up to the National Security Advisors, Brzezinski. He was literally on the telephone, ready to call President Carter to instruct him to launch a retaliatory attack, which means the end of the human species, when a message came in saying there was a false alarm. One of hundreds and hundreds of false alarms. The few periods that have been studied in detail shows that there are literally often hundreds a year. On the Russian side, it's got to be much worse. And some of these cases are really mind-boggling. I won't go into it. Anyway, that's what we're doing now. Both sides escalating. U.S. rapidly increasing forces, Russians too. Recently, a Russian military plane with its transponder off, the military planes fly both sides with transponders off so they can't be detected. A Russian military plane came within seconds of hitting a Danish commercial jet, which killed hundreds of people, and who knows what would have happened after that. I mean, these are the kind of things that could easily set off a terminal war. These are direct consequences of the expansion of NATO, which was, as Ken and others said, a tragic mistake of policy or of historic proportions, now especially when it extends to offers to incorporate Ukraine into the NATO system. Well, so one reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union was to extend NATO to Russia's borders. Another was to change NATO's mission, radically change NATO's mission. For the previous years, since its origin, NATO had been presented as a force intended to defend the West from the Russian hordes. No more Russian hordes, so we extend NATO to Russia's borders. And furthermore, its mission was officially extended, to become a worldwide military system with the goal of protecting the global energy system. That means pipelines, sea lanes, that's the world. And also to serve as an intervention force under U.S. command, a U.S.-run intervention force. And of course, one consequence of the Cold War is that intervention becomes much easier. The deterrent is gone. Well, so those are the two visions. Gorbachev's, of course, was rejected. The other one is what was implemented. Turkey, going to Turkey had remained, as it had been, a crucial NATO outpost. It's a crucial geostrategic position pointing directly into the Middle East, so quite important. With the Cold War over, it was no longer possible to pretend that U.S. and British intervention and violence was in defense against the Russian threat. Now disappeared. And in fact, when when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Bush 1 administration did come out with a number of policy decisions, a new defense strategy, a new budget, and they're quite interesting. One major point was that the vast military system had to be maintained, but not against the Russians, because they're disappeared, but in order to defend ourselves from the technological sophistication, that's the phrase used, from the technological sophistication of third world countries. We really have to tremble in fear before that, so we need this military system. Second point was that it was necessary to maintain what was called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry. People like us, MIT's right in the center of it. It's part of the place where the public funds, taxpayer funds, are used to develop the technology, the economy of the future for the benefit of corporate profits. So that's the defense industrial base, and that, of course, has to be maintained. And third, and in ways most interesting, had to do with the Middle East. So you have to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. And then came this interesting phrase, the Middle East, where the major problems we faced could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. And so they weren't. The problems weren't the Russians. Sorry, folks, we've been lying to you for half a century, but now we have to recognize the reality. The clouds have lifted. The problem is, and always was, what's called radical nationalism, meaning independent nationalism that disobeys orders. It's not under control. So that's what the problem was. The problems could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. Now we have to face these. What about Turkey? Right at this time, Turkey was escalating a vicious counterinsurgency campaign targeting the Kurdish population in the southeast. Much worse than today. No small matter. Maybe 40 or 50,000 people were killed. 3,500 towns and villages were wiped out. Every imaginable kind of torture and terror was taking place. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds, by some estimates millions of Kurds, were driven out of the southeast, refugees, many of them driven to the slums of Istanbul. I happened to be visiting towards the end of this campaign, visited some of the Istanbul slums where you found families living in a room in condemned buildings, unable to go outside because it's crime-ridden, drug-ridden. Some told us that they actually were given permission by the Turkish government to return to their villages and towns, but only on condition that they sign a statement saying that the villages had been destroyed by the PKK, Kurdish guerrillas, which they knew wasn't true, destroyed by the army. And many of them just refused to sign and continued, and I presume still continue to live under those horrendous circumstances, which incidentally practically nobody in Istanbul seems to know about. These slums are often condemned areas, nobody goes there. That's what was happening at the time. It's a major horror story. So what was the reaction of the enlightened states and the leader of the idealistic New World bent on ending inhumanity to these ongoing horrors in a NATO country? Straightforward. The U.S. was providing the arms. 80% of the arms to carry out these atrocities were supplied by the Clinton administration, mounting as the atrocities mounted. Turkey, in fact, became the world leader for recipient of U.S. arms. There's a qualification. There's a separate category, Israel and Egypt. They're off somewhere else. But apart from Israel and Egypt because of Israel, of course. So basically Israel. Aside from that, Turkey took the lead in receiving U.S. arms. In 1997, remember, that was the year when Clinton's foreign policy entered into a noble phase with a saintly glow. In that year, Clinton sent more arms to Turkey that single year than the entire Cold War period combined up to the onset of the counterinsurgency. That was the saintly glow. Americans knew very little about this, for one simple reason: the press refused to report it. Of course, everyone had a bureau in Ankara, New York Times, everyone else, but couldn't find this out. There were some reports. Human Rights Watch was reporting it. John Turman, who now heads the CIS, was reporting it. A couple of other people, Jonathan Randall, but you really had to work to find out about it. Well, that was the saintly glow of the enlightened states. The cynicism about this peaked in an interesting way in 1999. NATO in 1999 had its 50th anniversary. It was a pretty somber anniversary. There was lots of concern about crimes being carried out in the Balkans, which were pretty ugly, but didn't even begin to compare with atrocities that the U.S. was backing all over the world at the same time. Of course, the Balkans are different. The lament was, how can we Europeans tolerate atrocities going on right near the border of Europe? That's hard. On the other hand, it was quite easy to tolerate incomparably worse atrocities going on right within NATO, not on its borders, but within NATO, with the direct, decisive contribution of primarily the United States, but other NATO powers as well, Germany and others. That was never mentioned at the NATO meetings or in the commentary. That's impressive cynicism. By the year 2000, the Kurdish insurgency had been pretty much suppressed. The Turkish government remained controlled, and the arms flow to Turkey therefore reduced. It was no longer necessary to lead the enlightened states in their noble phase. So Turkey dropped out of first place. Of course, another country had to replace it. It was replaced by Colombia, which had by far the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere, and now moved to first place in receiving arms from the United States. Incidentally, there's absolutely nothing new about this. You go back to 1980, there was an important study by the leading academic specialist on human rights in Latin America, Lars Schultz. He studied the relation between U.S. aid, including military aid, and what he called egregious human rights violations, and they were pretty egregious, horrendous in fact. And he found a very close correlation. Academic article, nobody paid any attention. But there was another study done at the same time by a friend and colleague, co-author of mine, Edward Herman, an economist at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He studied the relation between U.S. aid, including military aid, incidentally this goes right through the Carter years, U.S. military aid, and improvements in the climate for business operations. So in terms of repatriation of profits and so on and so forth. And there was indeed a very close correlation. And that makes sense. It's understandable that U.S. policy would be directed to improvement in investor rights, business operations, and so on. But there's a second point. How do you improve the climate for business operations? Well, the best way is to murder union leaders, to assassinate human rights activists, business operations. Therefore, there is a secondary correlation between military aid and human rights violations. It's not that the United States is dedicated to torture and murder. It's just that this is a concomitant of an actual goal, commitment to improving the climate for business operations. And that after the early 80s, nobody even bothered to study this anymore. During the Reagan years, it was so obvious that a study would have been superfluous, and I'm now talking about what happened in the 90s and later, when it's also superfluous. Well, we're now up to 2000. In the following years, the situation in Turkey did improve, notably improve. There was some recognition of elementary Kurdish rights. There was limited options for Kurds to use their language, quite limited. But before that, it was lethal. And in general, there was a kind of a relaxation of the situation. I visited a couple times. Other people visited and seen it as well. There was also improvement, not marvelous, but improvement in the climate for freedom of speech. And quite interestingly, there was the beginning of a willingness to discuss, among the public at least, the question of the Armenian slaughter back a century ago, what many call the Armenian genocide. I was there a couple of years ago as a lecturer. There's a lectureship in honor of Hrant Dink, a journalist who was exposing the Turkish atrocities against the Armenians. He was murdered right outside the building where his offices were, and there's an annual lectureship. And the day I was there was a huge march through Istanbul, so big that the police didn't try to control it, supporting exposure of the atrocities in honor of Hrant Dink. It ended right in front of the building, publisher where he was. And actions took place as well. So, for example, in Diyarbakir in the southeast, sort of Kurdish capital, in the year 2000, first time I visited, Diyarbakir was the place where one of the last major massacres took place with Armenians. And I asked to see the Armenian church. There was an Armenian church, big Armenian church, so I asked if I could see it. They kind of reluctantly took me over. It was a total wreck, falling apart, the roof falling, and so on. I then asked to see if there had been anyone who collected any relics from the church, and I was taken to a small store nearby where an old Armenian man had collected some relics. That was 2000. A couple of years later, Turkish groups in Istanbul began a campaign to rebuild the church, reconstruct it, and apparently I haven't seen it. Apparently it's been rebuilt. There's all of these were beginnings of indications of real improvements of the climate in Turkey. It was pretty impressive. Now that was up till about 10 years ago. Then it switched. The Erdogan government has continually become authoritarian. Turkey quickly gained the worst record in the world for repression of journalists. It's now getting much worse, as you've heard. But bad as it is, and it's bad enough, it's worth bearing in mind that it is nothing like what happened very recently with decisive U.S., also European support. So the current cynicism, while real, is just a pale shadow of what has happened before and possibly a portent of what's coming. All of this is recent and it's in the back of everyone's mind. Well, the curfews now in the southeast have reached, in some areas, 100 days. There are many deaths. People are afraid to go out of their homes because of sniper attacks, heavy military equipment in the streets. We don't know much about what's happening, as you just heard, partly because human rights investigators and lawyers are just banned. So you can only get, as you heard from the comments, phone calls and so on. There are individual cases which give some of the picture. Give some cases. Amnesty International just released a couple of weeks ago a chilling report on the oppression. One example, they write that in a telling example of how little tolerance the authorities have for any form of dissent regarding the operations, on the 9th of January, state prosecutors initiated a criminal investigation for making, the official charge was making propaganda for a terrorist organization. It was issued against a chat show host. The investigation was launched after a caller to the show said that mothers and children were being killed in the Southeast and urged people not to stay silent about it. The chat show host thanked and applauded her for her contribution, saying he supported her call for peace. There was a media furor, death threats against those involved, investigation against the chat show host, the head of the television program, and the caller followed. That's the nature, it illustrates the repression. Just mention one more case. One of the most outrageous cases is the attack on Seven Nisanyan, who's in prison, been in prison for 2 years, over 2 years. He's right now facing a likely 25-year sentence. His crime is that he has been devoted completely selflessly for years to saving old villages, building houses, planting vegetation, creating jobs, creating environmental sanctuaries in a really saint-like manner. And in opposing zoning laws, he once broke seals placed by the authorities. That's the crime. He'll be in jail for the rest of his life if there's no substantial protest. But individual cases, and there are plenty of them, that barely hint at the severity of the repression, the attack on free expression, the bitter attack on the Kurdish population of the Southeast, which can hardly fail to elicit grim memories of what happened not many years ago. All of this is connected to what's going on in the neighboring regions of Iraq and Syria. The major ground forces combating ISIS, so-called Islamic State, in both countries, the major ground forces are Kurdish. There are detailed reports by Western journalists and researchers from the front lines. Recently, an important study by Scott Atran, right from the front lines, as one of the main researchers on jihadis. It's posted on the internet. They make it quite clear that the Kurdish militias of the PKK, the Turkish Kurdish militias based in northern Iraq, and the YPG in Syria, these are different names but very closely linked. They're the ones who are in the forefront of the resistance to ISIS. In Iraqi Kurdistan, they're the ones who prevented ISIS from conquering Iraqi Kurdistan when they were on the march. They're the ones who saved the remnants of the Yazidis from total destruction at the hands of ISIS. In Syria, they're the ground forces protecting the Kurds, holding back ISIS, moving into ISIS territory. And meanwhile, quite amazingly, they're apparently developing a remarkably decent society in Syria, considering the circumstances. And they are the primary enemies of Turkey. Turkey's actions in both countries are primarily directed against these forces. PKK is also on the U.S. terrorist list. Meanwhile, the point is that Turkey simply does not want an autonomous Kurdish area anywhere near its border because of its own repression and control of its Kurdish regions inside. Most of the Kurds in the world are in Turkey. Meanwhile, Turkey is giving tacit support for ISIS, not very secretly. It's providing a funnel for jihadis to move into the Islamic State areas, allowing commerce out of them, export of oil and so on. It's at the same time quite openly supporting the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the al-Nusra Front, which, like ISIS, is excluded from international negotiations as a terrorist force of radical Islamists. It's also incidentally supported by U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in this convoluted Syrian tragedy. And in all of this disgraceful tragedy, Erdogan has a very strong card to play, and he's playing it. He can exploit Europe's miserable reaction to the so-called refugee crisis, as he's now doing in the ongoing European Union-Turkey negotiations. But we should bear in mind that we're hardly in a position to criticize it. The U.S. is much worse, taking in no Syrian refugees. We have to be very cautious here. Some Syrian doctor might be a terrorist in disguise. You know about that. This is the safest country in the world and also the most frightened. It goes way back in American history. And much worse than that is what we're doing with regard to Central America. The refugees from Central America are fleeing from U.S. terror and violence. We destroy their countries, they flee, we then send them back. We pressure Mexico to do exactly what the European Union is doing with regard to Turkey, to keep them away from our borders. Of course, Mexicans are fleeing too, largely also our victims, many of them victims of NAFTA, which predictably wiped out Mexican agriculture. The Mexican campesinos can be quite efficient, but they can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness in what are called free trade agreements. So when we erect the place, you then keep them away. I'll put aside the racist ravings of Trump and others. But all in all, it's not a very attractive picture of the enlightened states and the idealistic new world bent on inhumanity. And it's a picture that we have it in our power to change, and something that we better do so and fast. Thanks.